No, for me it was just so sad.
Paul McCartney isn't safe from the emotional pull of music, even though they made some of the Dash one of the most famous songs in history. A song that hit so close to home made him cry. So what song to have that kind of effect on a Beatle that the story of the answer may surprise you. The last time John Lennon and Paul McCartney met was the best friends and the most busy songwriting team of the 1900s, called the painful and lasting turn that came after the Beatles broke up in 1970. But two sometimes ran into each other in the years that passed after they met were marked by stress and angry fights, and not fixed resentment. The bond that once brought great music had been worn down for a long time. Before the official ending of the band that shows signs of strain as early as 1965, by the middle of the 1960s, Lennon and McCartney were starting to lose their artistic touch both personally, and Lennon, growing more and more anxious and self-conscious, started looking into avant-garde art and politics, protesting and making weird music. Yoko Ono and McCartney, on the other hand, kept their devotion to the Beatles' success, and took on the job of leader in the last few years of their work, especially since Lennon took this back change in the dynamics, along with rising pressures from outside and different goals for the band's future, led to emotional distance between them. The biggest of the competition started after the Beatles officially broke up. What could have been a goodbye for both of them instead got into a verbal fight, with both artists letting out their anger in public through their own records. Lennon's straight attack on McCartney in his 1971 song How Do You Sleep, Zarina, a harsh review of Paul's songs and personality. McCartney, who was more reserved, he replied with his own compositions and conversations that often tried to keep a polite tone. He would later think about how their relationship was over well, but the emotions, how far apart they were, told us more a complicated story about love and spontaneity. They used to have a close bond as brothers, never really came back after the initial anger cooled down. The two did manage to meet in person once or twice, but those times were short-lived and often lacked the friendship they had in their younger days. In 1974, McCartney and Lennon took part in a free-form jam session with friends like Stevie Wonder and Harry Nilsson. While the recording was going on, never came out officially. It became a famous item among Beatles fans, being a short rekindling of their love, and then a rhythmic spark. In 1976, there was an almost mythical time when the two were in New York watching TV together. York, when they saw Lorne Michaels on Saturday Night Live joke about the Beatles' $3,000 to get back together for a few imaginary minutes with Lennon and McCartney, thought about taking a taxi down to the studio. Will finally surprise everyone, they chose not to do it. So it would be after that was their last time together. When their link started to weaken to sometimes phone calls or just echoes of the close friendship they used to have, a final meeting was planned. But in the end, Yoko Ono called it off, which hastens that the space between them had grown two buddies from the band. So after 1976, they didn't see each other again. The note from our last chat is still there. Feelings of love and sad as Lennon said goodbye to Paul. He told her, "Think about me every day, every once in a while, old friend." The quiet but moving act of a hint of weakness behind John Lennon's, after many years, otherwise sharp lines in 1981, this line would go back to Paul in a shocking and deeply moving way. In some way, during the meetings for his, McCartney was working on the Tug of War album with Carl Perkins. One of his and the early artistic heroes of Lennon were Perkins, moved by Lennon's sad death the year before, wrote a song about them called McCartney Heard, My Old Friend. From the words, he was moved to tears. Think about me now and then, my old friend. appeared exactly the same. What Lennon told him when they met last meeting, it hit Paul like a lightning bolt. He cried not only for the death of John Lennon, but for the death of everything left them and their friendship. On the evening of April 24th, but not said 1976. Almost legendary events took place. Almost John Lennon and Paul McCartney, two of the most iconic people in modern people who study music history, were sitting together in Lennon's room at the Dakota in New York City. The event was a rare meeting that was casual and not planned. The relationship between two ex-bandmates, who the fights that followed the Beatles' breakup were slowly putting together a friendship as they took it easy in Lennon's in the living room. They turned on the TV without knowing that the show they were about to watch would briefly put them in the middle of a surprise cultural what if. That night, Saturday Night Live had a now famous skit by producer Lorne Michaels with tongue-in-cheek hard in the cheek. Michaels looked into the camera and gave the Beatles the small amount of $3,000 to get back together on the show, that it was a joke about the huge numbers that performers often throw around desperate for a return of the Beatles. The joke, it was clear that the price was incredibly low, to draw attention to how silly the whole idea. But only what NBC couldn't perhaps thought that two of it wasn't just John and Paul. We were only a few blocks away, but watching from where the show was being filmed, John Lennon and Paul McCartney live show, they laughed and looked at each other, caught off guard by a sudden thought. What if they really went? If they went to 30 Rockefeller Plaza, walked into Studio 8H, and they got their half of the $3,000 for a short time before the two reformed Beatles really entertained the thought that it might have been one of the most natural times in a surprise in TV and music history. No one saw this meeting coming, but as soon as the thought came up, it became real. Crept back in. They were both tired, was late. The thrill of being spontaneous gave how to get to the pleasures of inertia, and in the end, they laughed off the idea and stayed. That was it. The world missed out on what could have been a famous moment, maybe even the spark that could have changed the course of their relationship to this day. And still, I wonder what would have happened if it left the next day. Paul McCartney went back to the Dakota. Most likely want to spend more time with Lennon. He might have thought they could play some songs together like they had on the spot during a jam session 2 years while before. But Lennon wasn't in the same. His life had changed in his mind a lot since his missed weekend years. He was focused on family life. He took care of his young son Sean and was slowly stepping out of the spotlight. That day, when Paul knocked on the door, Lennon turned him away, and that was the end of it. Whenever Paul showed up at my door with a guitar that John Lennon would later tell him, I would let him in, but finally I told him, "Please call ahead of time. Stop, it's not 1956, and go to the door isn't the same as it used to be." John Lennon wasn't mad. Just give me a call. Just worn out and overcome with the needs of being a father, and the desire for the words he spoke hurt for McCartney, who used to have it almost of being telepathically close to John. It felt cold and far away to call ahead. It was a painful reflection of how they felt about each other had changed in ways that could not be undone. That event marked but they had grown. By this point the emotional gap is briefly narrowed between them, opened the easy way again. Friendship of their youth, once filled with laughter late at night writing songs, and once more shared dreams, gave way to, even though they've made a few phone calls over the next few years, they would never see each other again. In the years after they broke up, the Beatles, who used to be close friends when John Lennon and Paul McCartney were together, was hard to understand, at times painfully far away. Even though they were angry, and the disappointment that hung over the breaking up of their famous partnership There were times when efforts to bring these times back together, even though they were rare, were filled with a quiet kind of beauty that shows how close they are that had once defined their youth and ideas by the late 1970s, the sharp edges of their feud after the Beatles had began to soften. And what was left was the need or even the desire to find to each other again. But this time not as friends, they talked like old friends. Over the years. On the phone a few times. But one of those talks a few months ago, the death of John Lennon in 1980 stands out. To honor Paul McCartney with a certain clarity thinking about it, after many years, McCartney talked about the conversation not as a deep or an exciting time, but as something far everyday, and maybe for that reason very important. It was very important to me that we reaching that point. Paul said, since you know you've had the bad thing about the group breaking up following the public fight, the lawyers' fights, and the feelings that aren't said wounds they'd left behind after some time apart. The two men had come to a quiet understanding that under all the despite their past and pain, they still loved each other. I think we just realized, guys, we love each other. What are we? We're just messing around. That last phone call was easy and at home. No one talked about music. Bold plans to work together, no going over old complaints again. Instead, the two old friends found comfort in the normal way of talking in everyday life. Paul remembered how they talked with love about making bread. It was a strange, perfect topic, boring, healthy, a sign of the peaceful life Lennon had chosen. I spoke bread and got pretty good at it. Paul remembers laughing while he was at it. So when I heard John was doing it, it would be great to talk about something so normal that there is no danger or anything. They talked about for life. Friends might share funny jokes, taking pleasure in the little things, simple pleasure of being in each other's company. Even if it's just over the phone, there were only two guys talking about, well, I don't know what you'd do if you left. What do you do? Leave it overnight? Paul. And so I said, yeah, I'll leave it. Leave it in the hot cupboard overnight, and you'd just talk. And it was really what we talked about meant more than on the surface. It might have looked like was the return of something important, a feeling of going back to their roots, McCartney thought. I was so glad that we got back together with that person we always told you when we were kids that we wore each other out for so long that it was great to go back to that after all the trouble they had been through to find comfort again, and the comfort of a link that was once there for his part. Unbreakable. Lennon was also having opened up after years of domestic and solitude to raise his children, taking care of his son Sean, and his house with Yoko Ono. He had just left, showed a rising desire to go back to. He joked about music with his usual wit. Paul that he was ready to stop being there was a spark of he spoke with excitement and a desire to get back into the artistic world that he had put it aside for a few years. Wasn't a big news moment, but to Paul it seemed like a sign of hope that something could happen. Fresh start. And then as the call to Lennon left Paul with a line after they broke up that would keep going for the rest of McCartney's in life. Sometimes think of me, my old friend. It was a soft, sad goodbye. Not exciting but very warm. There was no way to know if it would be them last. Several months later, we had a talk. John Lennon was December 8, 1980, and killed outside of the New Dakota, New York City. The news shocked everyone, and it broke Paul's heart to realize that their last link had been cut off. Something as easy and everyday as baking the bread only made the mental weight heavier. There would be no last meeting. The truth, there was no chance to pick up the call again in the morning of December 9, 1980. Just hours after John Lennon had been killed brutally outside the world was at home in New York City having trouble understanding that there was shocked silence among lost fans. Vigils with candles were held all over every news station and radio show honors, and tributes began to come in for the man who helped change the way current music is made, who had been in the middle of the cultural shift of the back in the 1960s. The world lost a genius, but among all of this grief, one voice stood out for a short time and seemed to not caring about it. It was Paul McCartney's. A camera group went up to McCartney as he was leaving the studios of Error in London, where he worked that day keeping up with work on his new solo CD called Tug of War, which went on to turn into one of the most reflective records of his work after the Beatles' job. But at that moment, standing in the street with a lot of reporters around him, Paul seemed to be cut off. Almost, he said, "Well, I was just listening to I didn't want some of those things. To stay at home and do nothing? Oh God, didn't feel like it," he said, clearly upset when asked him what time he heard the news of Lennon's death. He said, "This morning." "Yeah, I don't know when that is." "Yes, it's a drag, right?" "Okay, cheers." He turned quickly and left to a lot of people, especially those watching from it was shockingly cold outside, as people said. Being emotionless or even heartless is a drag. Stuck out in newspapers and on television was very different from the sad words fans have written, and friends and enemies alike asked how McCartney and Lennon wrote songs for a long time. Partner and most important co-worker could how to react to such a huge loss in such a way that seems careless, but what most people didn't get was that at that time, McCartney was in a deep. It's possible that his body was in London, but the terrible event was still fresh in his mind. When he woke up that morning, the man he had shared the most important and decades of his life with was all of a sudden gone quickly. Paul, like many others, did it for no reason. They just didn't know how to handle how big it all is in the end. McCartney would say that I didn't mean to be cold, or I just heard the news, she said. I was still shocked an hour or two before. What do you say when? He asked himself. A mic is put up against your face. You're just trying at that point to figure it out for yourself. The drag he was talking about wasn't flippancy. It was shocked and sad scent, awkwardly under the weight of grief and